Hey all, and welcome to There's Danger Here. I'm Leilani, and today I'm going to do a collaboration episode with the amazing Daniel. He's the creator of No Holmes Barred, and I'm excited to chat a bit about the American serial killer. Once we wrap up Holmes, a doctor in Chicago in the late 1800s, I'll fast forward us into the early 2000s, and my case discusses a nurse in Texas that said she wanted to help others after her own near-death experience, yet she maliciously killed those in and around her care. I hope everyone enjoys this episode as much as I did talking with Daniel.
Today we're going to talk about H.H. Holmes. That seems to be your wheelhouse. You know a lot about that man.
Yes, it's not a very pleasant place for me to be mentally, I guess, making this deep dive into
Yeah.
the head of a bona fide sicko. But I think there's absolutely a ton to glean from his whole story that I think applies far beyond the macabre and just the typical true crime avenues. So, I think as I'm sure you can relate, once you just sort of pulling that thread, you just got to keep pulling until you get to the end and just see where it goes.
Yeah, I love that. And I've heard various stories of him, bits and pieces. I didn't want to do quite a deep dive on all the episodes that you did because I didn't
Sure.
want to
Yeah.
ruin anything. I like to be
Well, I mean,
surprised. I like to have
yes,
that face of like, oh my gosh, what did you just say?
yes,
Um,
yes. And there are a lot of those things with H. Holmes in general. I mean, the man is famous for building a castle, a murder castle. It was
yes.
as far as society, as far as the town of Chicago was concerned in 1890, this was a hub for his businesses, which it was. Also a hub for committing murders, and which he also very much did. So honestly, I would say with No Holmes Barred, which is my podcast, it's an
Mhm.
audio drama rather. Um, with that, it's less about what happened with Holmes's story and all about just how it happened, because I think that is the real meat of the story. That yes, he did amazingly absurd, uh, things in terms of just how evil it was. Not just evil, but absurd. But not just that. The circumstances that allowed for this were every bit as crazy. Just again, how do you hide in plain sight when doing all that?
Yeah.
And that's what we examined.
Well, good. I would love for you to tell me more about him.
He was a medical doctor,
Mhm.
which is exceedingly rare for a serial killer, as far as I understand, because a lot
Yeah.
of serial killers don't tend to see, uh, academia through. They don't tend to make it through all of those demands that it usually poses. But
Hmm.
make no mistake, he was definitely smart enough to be a doctor. He just wasn't. He apparently was not as smart as the other doctors, for sure, because he was bottom of his class, just completely exploitative, just thrived on using whatever information that he absorbed for evil. So, and you'll see that as Holmes, he was many, many things throughout the course of his life. As we touched on, he was an entrepreneur. He was a medical doctor. He was even an architect. He drew the plans for his murder castle, technically speaking. It was a
Hmm.
really shoddy building at the end of the day. But yeah, I think that's kind of the essence of Holmes, is that he was a lot of things and all of them suck.
Yeah.
Sucked at all of them. Just also,
Yeah.
you add grave robber, polygamist, pathological liar,
Hmm.
all the above, murderer.
Was the grave robbing part of the medical portion or just his own gains? Because I know kind of back in that day, I feel like a lot of medical doctors or those going to school for medical ended up either partaking in grave robbing or were kind of on the end of it where they would take bodies from grave robbers in order to do autopsies and such.
Well, I mean, you're spot on there. I haven't read anything, or I haven't come across anything specifically about robbing the grave robbers. But look, I wouldn't doubt that things like that were possible. I wouldn't doubt that things like that, didn't happen or anything like that
Hmm.
too. It's I think what we conclude from something like that is, it's all a supply chain issue, right? Like
Yeah.
sometimes
Yeah.
robbing grave robbers is the backbone of the logistics to any thriving industry. So,
Sure.
but yeah, that's what was going on is, there were doctors, there was an advent of, I guess we can call it semi-modern medicine going back in the late 1890s. But but there just weren't enough cadavers for
Hmm.
students to experiment on, to learn about the human body. And a lot of universities took it upon themselves to, just gather their own dead because the government was not providing these resources.
Yeah.
And and they wouldn't just, it wasn't just an implicit, understanding either. It was, there are quotes, I think, from the medical director of University of Louisville, I believe, back in the 1890s, who's just straight up said, yeah, we're going to keep doing this until the government steps in and stop us. so
Yeah.
so yeah,
So he wasn't alone in that part.
certainly not. And I think that yes, I think he, under the just the presumption that this is all for his medical training, sure, I think that's how he made those crimes, I guess, a little bit more palatable. But in hindsight, oh, does it paint a picture?
Hmm. All right. Well, do you want to tell me about how he grew up, or do you just want to kind of get into when he starts his murder
Oh,
sprees,
oh yeah, sure. I
what he
mean,
does?
well,
How would you like to
it
roll?
was well, I mean, I guess the life cycle from doctor to murderer is
Yeah.
maybe not a uniform one. Maybe not. I think that he forged his own unique path. Let's just say that
Yeah.
he grew up. The majority of what he became famous for happened during the 1893 World Fair in Chicago. But about his early life, he was just, and here's the crazy thing as well, as I'm sure that, as I know that, you guys have touched on, a lot of serial killers tend to grow up in pretty broken environments, very deeply unhealthy ones. And I'm not saying that Holmes didn't per se, but from what I understand, at least when you grade on the curve of what constitutes normal for 1890s America, or
Hmm.
1880s America, I should say, Holmes, generally speaking, had a pretty typical childhood. He didn't have parents who were unavailable or unsupportive, is my understanding. And despite all of that, he really, I think where you could really pinpoint some kind of origin story for him, and this does get covered in No Holmes Barred. When he actually, one of his biggest fears as a young child was the doctor's office. And
Yeah.
specifically about that was the cadavers, or sorry, rather the human skeletons, and these would be real, and they would be on display in a lot of these doctor's offices. And that is what terrified a young H.H. Holmes. Um, his friend, a bunch of older neighborhood kids got wind of this fear. And what they did is they locked him in a room with a skeleton just for, I don't remember the exact amount of time, but it was then that Holmes even said himself, and I'm just going to put this out there as a quick aside, judge what he says with a grain of salt. This is just, because the man was a pathological liar. And
Sure.
but as far as this account goes, he had spent time just one on one with this skeleton. And it was there where he became really fascinated with, all of the ways that the human body worked. He was just identifying these bones and trying to attribute a purpose for each one. This is where at least he attributes, the beginning of his sort of morbid curiosity. And as we later found out, that was never held in check, you know,
Yeah.
not whatsoever. And by the time he was a teenager, and by the time he was a young medical student, he was doing extremely questionable things in his own home. There have been very, very unsettling discoveries by his landlord, for example, in literally his bedroom, and no one put a stop to it right then and there.
Yeah. When you talked about the locking him up in like with a skeleton, that reminded me of Fear Factor. I don't know if you remember that
Yeah,
show, but how they used to
I
take
do.
your extreme fear and be like, all right, well, that's what we're doing. That's what I picture. Like, oh, you have a fear of skeletons? Here you are. You have to be right next to one
Uh,
now. It's a
you
heck
know,
of a way to
I
get over
think
fear.
I would take that over the food challenges.
Yeah.
Just those I remember traumatizing me as a kid. You know, just like also just grew up a picky eater. Where I mean, I've since grown out of that, thankfully, but I just remember thinking how screwed I would be if I was on the show and forced to do something like this, or else, you
Yeah.
know, lose the competition.
Yes. So other than the being scared into enjoying skeletons, how did he get into medicine?
Hmm. Well, I I understand. So, from what I understand with Holmes, is that the morbid fascination was just kind of always there for him. I think he saw medicine as a means to continue feeding that curiosity, or I don't even think you can call it a curiosity, it would be an obsession, which
Mhm.
it quickly turned into. There, the unfortunate thing about Holmes is that there is just so much noise with his story, with him being billed as America's first serial killer, which was not just unusual for the time, it's highly unusual in hindsight, especially with his methods and just the means he went to accomplish whatever he did. So, unfortunately, that also brought the advent of a lot of yellow journalism in America, just sensationalized stories that are about Holmes that sound real, you know, because of all of the atrocities he really did commit. But Holmes was also a pathological liar. So when you kind of combine all of these things going on and journalists just sort of running with stories that they could never verify, you do get a lot of noise. And an area where there is a lot of that noise is his pre-Chicago history.
Mhm.
So you do have stories about him. You know, he was a teacher at one point before he went to Chicago, which is just so comforting that he was around children so much. So just great. But there were accounts of him bringing a severed human foot to school one time, and that but there's also as far as I understand, I don't think there's a ton of veracity to that, but that's kind of the point, is when you have this guy who just builds a fake hub for businesses and instead just gasses and burns his victims and, sells their skeletons off to medical science. What is off the table at this point?
Mhm. I know he has a murder house that's pretty famous. Can you kind of walk me up to the point that he creates this thing?
So when he came to Chicago, he actually lived with with a couple, these two elderly pharmacy owners, and unfortunately, the husband, or the man of the couple, he was diagnosed, I believe, with a terminal cancer, and he ultimately did pass away. But I don't think he was very involved with much of what Holmes was doing when he was living with them. Obviously, Holmes was opportunistic here. He got to be around medicine. He got to establish trust by asserting his usefulness to a family that was, or rather, a couple that was in a lot of stress because of this illness. and they had a business to run. Holmes demonstrated his ability there, and he ultimately was bequested this pharmacy that they had, suspiciously, but unverifiably, crucially, this couple didn't live too long after they accepted Holmes into their life. One being terminally ill, there's definitely plausible deniability there. And for the elderly woman, just having having not much time left as well, that can at least give Holmes, some plausible deniability there. But I would say make up your, just come to your own conclusions about that, unfortunately, because that's all we can really do at this point. Mm-hmm. So yeah, and he used that pharmacy ultimately to amass money to build his famed murder castle, just right across the street, I believe. I could be wrong about that, but it was at least very nearby. And it just kind of kept expanding and growing from there. And Holmes, he ingratiated himself with the community too. He just had, on paper, all of his exploits just sound suspicious, but he had this way of making people feel like they were the only person in the room when he was talking to them. He was extremely charismatic and extremely manipulative. So he was able to tell a lot of half-truths to get by, very much like this situation where he is taken in by this elderly couple. It looks suspicious, but can we really just assume the worst constantly about this guy who's just so polite and has done so much for, local businesses around here, even though he did not. He just had one. And it was just a very, it just kind of kept snowballing from there. And I think the crucial detail with all of this is Chicago as a whole in 1890, is that Chicago, remember, 20 years ago, before that, burned to the ground with the Great Chicago Fire. It was still trying to come back. It was already a bustling, chaotic, almost, if you will, town, very fast growing and growing too fast for, its britches. And that's, no fault of their own, of course, and I'll be clear, none of this is Chicago's, the townspeople, rather, of Chicago's fault here. I think they were earnestly doing their best to recover. And then Chicago gets the World Fair, which hosts crowds in the hundreds of thousands. So this is a perfect storm for somebody who can just hide in the shadows and do whatever he wants. And that's exactly what wound up happening.
Do you want to go into a little bit more about like the World Fair time and kind of when he was the most active?
Oh man, like I said, it is really difficult to attribute a lot of his crimes because of all the sensationalism and just his own inconsistency with his accounts. So it's honestly a little bit hard to say when he was the most active, but I do know he sure was active towards the end of everything when his hubris was just at an all-time high. He really did think he could get away with anything. He could manipulate anyone under his thumb, and even those who weren't. And why would he not think that? Because he went his whole life doing this. And I just, I obviously during the World Fair itself is when he was really at the peak of his manipulation. There's evidence that he wanted to expand and make a murder castle of his own in the plains of Texas, in addition to Chicago. He went scamming people over tons of state lines, just, any sort of grift that he could do, he did. A lot of it had to do with insurance fraud and the use of cadavers and him, just really applying where his skill set was to these nefarious schemes.
Mhm.
So, he, from what we understand about Holmes, ultimately, no, he didn't. Holmes confessed, I think, to 28 murders, and almost all of them have been debunked. Because at the time he claims to have murdered people who were still alive. First of all, that kind of puts a damper in your
Yeah.
credibility. But also, you know, he only was ever convicted for one murder. That's ultimately all they could pin on him. But from what we know in hindsight, we are pretty sure that he committed 9 murders in total, which is
Okay.
still 9 too many, but it's a far cry from the 200 or so that the media had been reporting back during the turn of the century, the turn of the 20th century.
And how did he get himself caught?
Hubris. Well, I like to really, I like to kind of put a parallel to this.
Mhm.
I don't know how familiar you are with Al Capone. I'm sure you have some familiarity for sure, but
Yeah, I know a little bit about him.
yeah, of course, just he, obviously bootlegger, mob boss, call him whatever you want,
Mhm.
serial killer in his own right, just how much blood is on his hands.
Mhm.
But ultimately, where he went down, or the beginning of the end for him, was tax evasion. So I just think it's, one of those things. It's hilarious to me in a very morbid way that somebody who can cause so much unspeakable suffering doesn't get an eyelash batted at him or even a slap on the wrist, for
Yeah.
that matter. It's just when you defraud Uncle Sam, when you prevent Uncle Sam from getting his dollars in his pocket, is when, oh, okay, now the government's going to start raising some eyebrows. Maybe we should hold this guy to account.
Yeah.
Similar thing with H. Holmes, actually. It wasn't tax
Hmm.
evasion, although I am certain he must have. And if I haven't picked up on that from someone else's, from historians and stuff, my apologies for selling that short, first of all. But what I will say is that, what really got him in hot water was defrauding creditors,
Oh.
just basically taking these loans and buying all sorts of products from other businesses, just for example, like furniture, just for his fake hotel that he ran, by the way. He rarely ever paid for anything. And because of how charismatic he was, he could get himself out of these situations. And you'll see that in No Holmes Barred, just how exactly he went about that. Um, but it was um, that which ultimately got the attention. Now, I will say, not of the government, because they didn't really have the sophisticated, you know, police force or justice system that we have today in order to track down these killers. If you wanted justice back in the 1890s, what you had to do was pay for it, because police offices, or rather, like police departments, didn't really know what their purpose was at this point, 30 years
Yeah.
after they were established for catching runaway slaves. So it was a whole lot of just shoulder shrugging there. So this is where the Pinkertons came in, private detective agencies, and insurance companies and creditors naturally had their own that they ultimately sent after Holmes, and this is where kind of the beginning of the hot water being turned up on him. And this is where he
Hmm.
started going on the run from town to town and defrauding people, and just even taking his victims with him on a cross country train ride, essentially. So it was that, and then some very, very shrewd detective work by a man named Frank Geyer, who did a lot of deep digging into Holmes. And ultimately, what he did was he was able to go on a goose chase throughout America, just following his trail from hotel to hotel, where and the only reason he knew to do this is because he recognized the aliases that Holmes used to sign into the book. So if Holmes just got a little more creative, or maybe used a new alias that he hadn't before, we wouldn't know
Yeah.
who he is today.
Yeah. You said that we know of 9 people for sure that he
Yes,
is murdered.
most
Do you
likely.
want
Yeah, I mean, I would be absolutely shocked if these accounts were inaccurate. Excuse me.
to? Okay. What did he get sentenced for?
He was ultimately convicted of murdering his associate, his longtime right hand man named Benjamin Peitzel. And this was the only charge that he ever faced. Or I'm sorry, this is the only, that's what he was convicted of. But I believe, as far as the trial goes, like that was all that they were trying to convict him of as well. This was a man who has a long history with Holmes, and basically what ultimately did him in. And I don't want to give too much away about this, but um, he and Benjamin Peitzel had a plan where Holmes wanted to do the insurance fraud scheme that he's conducted so many times, of where somebody with a very hefty insurance policy is, or sorry, their cadaver rather is presented, but it's a corpse of someone else, and Holmes would use that and leverage that to collect on the behalf of the person with the policy. He was going to do that with Ben Peitzel and his family. He got Peitzel's family involved in this, where so that included his wife, and even the 5 kids that Ben Peitzel had were involved in this scam. And what the pretense was they were going to fake Benjamin Peitzel's death. They were going to have his wife identify, quote unquote, I guess your listeners can't see I'm making air quotes. She was going to identify the body, right? She was going to identify the body, and Ben Peitzel, of course, had a huge insurance policy. And after they collect the money, H.H. Holmes was going to move them out west where they could live happily ever after, rich as can be. But of course, instead of just digging up a cadaver for this, Holmes just murders Ben Peitzel. He's like, this is just easier to do. That way the family, when they quote unquote identify him, they'll be like, yeah, this corpse kind of looks really similar. Wow, good job, But the family was unwittingly being victimized themselves. This is the patriarch of the family who, was trying to rescue them. He was trying to get them into a better life. The Peitzels lived in poverty, and they really, their only crime was, they were going to defraud an insurance company, but at the same time, with winter coming in Chicago in 1890, when people literally die of starvation still, even in this, civilization, they put their eggs in the complete wrong basket here. And they ultimately, unfortunately, I can say not many of them made it out alive.
Sure. Since he was convicted of the one murder, what was his sentence?
He was sentenced to be hanged, and they did this the day of the verdict. So they really didn't waste any time trying to do
no
that.
appeals for him.
Yeah, like he just no appeals, and I think that, again, keep in mind how many years he evaded justice. And with him, his hanging, I believe his death was in 1896, ultimately in Philadelphia. So that's another feather in that town's cap for sure. So yeah. And what I love, though, is that, Holmes, even at the gallows, did not admit to killing Ben Peitzel. Also, he completely changed his mind, it seems, every time he opened his mouth. That's what liars do. There were kernels of truth in everything he said,
Hmm.
but it was still 90% bullshit at any given moment. And they hanged him, and he did not, I will say it was not a quick death for him. He
No.
suffered, absolutely. And my favorite part, I think, about that is before they hanged him, he had a last request of having his tomb encased in concrete so that grave robbers and anyone else couldn't interfere with his corpse. And I'm just like, oh, is that a
Sure.
sore spot for you, bro? Like, really? Oh, that's the line. Huh,
Of course.
fascinating. You didn't seem to find any problem with that when you had been doing it. But yeah, let's go ahead and just, lock that down for you. So, and he got his wish
Oh
somehow.
gosh.
The bow to tie around this is, even though Holmes did not want his corpse defiled in any way, it was. It was unearthed actually. I think only a few years, like maybe 5 years ago. I think around COVID. There were some historians actually who unearthed his tomb to examine just everything that was left behind. Rumors, that there were rumors that like he's Jack the Ripper, and which
I
again,
think I think a lot of
baseless.
people thought that, but they recently, God, within the last, what, 1 or 2 weeks, they think that they have DNA to confirm who Jack the Ripper was.
No kidding, I haven't heard about this.
Yeah, it just came out, I think, a week or two ago. I can't remember who they named. I wrote it down so I could look it up. But they named somebody because they
Okay.
got a female family, like way, way, of course, but they got a female family member's DNA, and they were able to link it back to who it was.
And they
It
think,
just came
okay,
in the
so
news. Yeah.
wow, okay, so this is basically 23andMe coming
Yeah.
in.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So they had
Yeah.
DNA of some, okay, so it's familial DNA.
Hmm.
Oh wow, okay.
Yeah.
That
So
is
it wasn't
just,
H.H. Holmes. I know so many people thought that it was him because he was fit the profile. He was there during the time, but it wasn't him.
do you know, but what really I mean, there during the time, I'd have to get back to you on. But what I do know the genesis was for all of this was it really just came back to travel records where a man with
Hmm.
the last name of Holmes
Holmes.
had
Yeah.
had put his had signed into this ship, and it's just
Hmm.
like, what, really? Did nobody else have the last name of Holmes in, like, you guys are really stretching here just to
Hmm.
connect the name Holmes on a boat to being the most prolific, mysterious, murderer,
Yeah.
and at the time. Ugh,
Hmm. Yeah.
just
Well, thank
amazing.
you for telling me all about him. I know that he's very notorious. I always think it's interesting to hear about people like that.
Yeah, it's just and I will say that, like, for anyone who's here, I know there's a morbid fascination with his crimes, and don't get me wrong, um, No Holmes Barred absolutely delves into them, but there is
Hmm.
also a societal aspect that's covered here too. There is there's just all sorts of information. There's a storyline of the World Fair's planners, the whole separate storyline about them and what they're going through, because I truly believe that Holmes's story is inextricable from that of Chicago's during the time. You have to understand why this happened in order to appreciate, what happened and how he was
Hmm.
brought to justice. So, just, it was a very uniquely American story. I think that the thing that is really fascinating about this, I don't know, I'm sure you've heard similar sentiments of this, but you know how they say, you're just as likely to encounter a psychopath in the boardroom as you are in a prison. Well, that's not just a saying. There's been studies on this. The one I love was University of San Diego School of Business did this actually, like I think 2021, where they
Mhm.
discovered that 12% of corporate senior leaders display a range of psychopathic traits. And when you compare that to what the population of psychopathic traits in a prison is 15%. It's
Mhm.
basically, it's very comparable. And
Yeah.
1% of the general population exhibits these traits. So you are 12 times more likely to experience that in a boardroom as you would a prison cell, or I'm sorry, as you would
Mhm.
walking down the street. And I think
Yeah.
that's actually the point of a lot of this is that, yes, Holmes was a brutal murderer. He was also brutal from a hyper unchecked capitalistic standpoint too. And I think there are a lot of people out there kind of beleaguered by that, especially today. So I always think that the best predictor of the future is the past. So I'd welcome anyone who wants to see how it was dealt with in a lot of ways back then. There are things you can learn from it,
Hmm.
and that's I think where I'll leave it.
Oh, good. Well, I appreciate it. That was a lot of fun. I brought in, I think we talked about a little bit, Kimberly Saenz. She is a nurse. I know you brought in the doctor. I bring in the nurse. I am a nurse. So I just thought it was kind of apropos to bring this in. And the reason I also brought it in is about a week before, we were talking about how this particular kind of nurse. I had seen a documentary and they said that, had become a killer. And I said, how would they know? Because what she does is pretty hard on the body. So there's a lot of people that are very sick that she deals with. So you'll get a sense as we start to talk about it, but I don't want to just give you all the answers right away.
No, I'm really fascinated by this case for sure.
Yeah, I was
Especially
too.
just yeah, like not just the story that you're about to get into, but just how it was handled. I think by the you know what, forget I said it. Please just
We'll
go.
get into it. So Kimberly Saenz was born Kimberly Clark Fowler on November 3rd, 1973, to parents William Kent Fowler, or Kent, and Benjamin Francis, or Benny, in Lufkin, Texas. 3 years later, Kimberly became a big sister to William, who went by Cody. Everybody has nicknames in this story.
Yes, they do.
Uh, and they shared a birthday. Kent worked to support the family at Rush Truck Center while Benny went to work at the local Walmart. They sound like a pretty average family, nothing crazy that sticks out. There's no signs of abuse or anything that I can see in her childhood. Kimberly herself was an average student in all aspects during her school years. Several people within her cohort reported that Kimberly was overly quiet and small, kind of with an acne problem that didn't quite fit in with everybody else. During her sophomore year, she began dating senior Chris Hopper. On July 26th, 1991, just before starting her senior year, Kimberly gave birth to Jacob Hopper and married Chris. They stayed together for 6 years, but divorced in October of 1997, after which time Kimberly worked for the Fleetwood Transportation Services in DeBold, Texas, about 10 miles away from Lufkin. So she didn't really leave the hometown.
Mm.
On September 9th, 1999, Kimberly was hospitalized with pneumonia. Bad enough she was sent to Methodist Hospital in Houston, and Kimberly reports that it was her near-death experience that pushed her into embracing Christianity. And shortly after, she met Mark Saenz, who went by Kevin. Again, Kevin had a laundry list of arrests under his belt by the time he met Kimberly, including theft, possession of more than 5 but less than 50 grams of marijuana, and multiple traffic violations. One in Arizona that led to a warrant when he was a failure to appear in October of 1999. But still, she knew all this, and regardless, the two married on June 10th, 2000. Kimberly gave birth to their daughter, Madison Grace, on December of the same year. And then in August of 2002 is when Kimberly began her nursing program at Angela Community College. She graduated in December of 2004 as a licensed vocational nurse. So in that area of the country, they call them LVNs. Most of the rest of the country, it's LPN, which is just licensed practical nurse. They have the
Mhm.
same responsibilities, but just in case anybody gets confused by that terminology, because it's very localized to like
Hmm.
California and a couple of the southern states.
I didn't realize
Uh,
that. Interesting.
yeah, yeah. I hadn't heard of it until I came out here and somebody in California was like, "Oh, I'm an LVN." And I was like, "What? What is that?" Turns out it's the same thing as an LPN.
Yes.
She immediately went to work for Memorial Hospital in Lufkin, but left 5 months later. At the time, it's unknown under what circumstances she left, but Memorial Hospital indicated they would not hire her back. That's pretty common with hospitals. They don't always give a reason why employees are fired. They'll just let them go. This, unfortunately, unless they make an accusation, allows somebody to continue working when perhaps they might not. But
Right.
it's still common practice today. It still happens today.
Fascinating too, because so I'm wondering, of course, is the reason that that's not publicized, is that could that be a HIPAA thing? Because under the circumstances where she
It shouldn't
was,
because it's
maybe
an
let go.
employee. Yeah, because she's an employee, it shouldn't. But nursing, you have to have specific licensures. When you're a nurse, you have to renew it. And
Okay.
there's boards of nursing in every state that will investigate any issues. So you can
Right.
lose your license if, say, they think that you're taking meds from somebody or
Sure.
doing other kind of events like that. But this one wasn't specified.
Right. So, I mean, obviously, yeah, they have the power to investigate it. I'm referring, I guess, more to the fact that they didn't publicize a reason. Like, I'm wondering
Hmm.
if like if it was, you could call it negligence, or I mean even like maliciousness in the ways that she treated some of these patients per se. If that was the
Hmm.
case, then I'm wondering if that could be, depending on the patient's condition, I'm wondering if maybe that wouldn't be publicized. But you know
They wouldn't name,
what do I know?
yeah, they wouldn't name the patients because that would be a HIPAA violation, but they can still name, um,
Hmm.
kind of what she did, her aspect, in order to get a license suspended. So,
Gotcha. Okay, cool.
yeah, so after that, she picked up work at Woodland Heights in Lufkin, but in August 2005 was fired for stealing Demerol. And Demerol is an opioid used to treat pain. And the Texas State Board of Nursing had not completed an investigation right away. Kind of, it took a long time for an investigation to come through. And so, with that, because nothing was reported, nothing would show up on her license. So, from the hospital, Kimberly went to Right Choice Home Health, and she lasted less than 2 months before being let go. According to them, it was for no call, no show, or tardy attendance. So that was an attendance issue, not administration of anything. Shortly after, Kimberly was admitted for depression and suicidal thoughts to Brentwood Hospital in Shreveport, Louisiana. So they took her to Louisiana for this. And after being discharged, Kimberly worked for Lufkin State School, a state facility for people with developmental and mental disabilities. She worked there from October 1st, 2006 to the 31st, and then she was terminated at that job as well.
It's getting
Um,
shorter and shorter tenures at places.
yes, she has a
Yeah.
very, you're going to hear, I'm doing kind of all the quick turnarounds that she's got.
Yeah. Despite all of this, and time has passed, like since, you know, for example, just working, like what's the timeline, do you know, of her working in the hospital after graduating? Okay, so she graduated in 2004,
Mhm.
gets her first job, I guess, shortly after.
2000, yeah, December of 2004. She
Wow.
graduated in August, so it was right away.
Right. And so now we're at where she works for, a state facility for patients with mental disabilities, and
Hmm.
lasts less than a month. And what
Hmm.
year is this?
2006 is where we're in.
And Texas State Board of Nursing still hasn't begun their investigation, or at least hasn't
No.
concluded it.
Hmm.
Wow.
But I
Wow,
will
that's
say a lot of new nurses do bounce around from jobs. That's not super surprising because these are different specialties.
Mhm.
So maybe she got there and was like, oh, this is not for me. That's pretty common.
Right.
We even see it in the hospital where nurses will bounce into different departments and they're like, you know, especially like oncology. They're like, I thought I could handle it. I can't. So then they
Yeah.
try like cardiology and they're like, I like this, or maybe it's still not my niche.
Mhm.
So really the fact that she has kind of this history, I don't think is that surprising in the healthcare world. Like, I don't think it's a
Right.
red flag that everybody thinks it would be. You're like, oh, she probably just was like, still not my thing.
Yeah, it's just another way of kind of there's plausible deniability there. It's how
Hmm.
you can hide in
Hmm.
plain sight. These are, I mean, obviously there are weird, like weirdly short tenures, but not suspiciously short tenures,
Yeah.
especially just
Hmm.
under the circumstances. Okay, that makes sense. That's interesting now.
Yeah. And so on November 27th, 2006, she started at the Children's Clinic of Lufkin, and Kimberly
Oh,
made it to
great.
May of 2007 before being let go. The clinic reprimanded her on March 20th for missing 8 days of work as a no-call, no-show. And
Jeez.
she applied for unemployment after this last firing was denied. Also pretty common. Nurses, because they can find jobs very easily, often we don't apply for unemployment.
Mm.
Like, no, there's
Yeah,
openings everywhere. Just
there's
try.
nurses in demand, all sorts of
Yes,
departments. Yeah, absolutely.
correct.
It's actually I'm just harkening back to just a personal experience of mine, honestly. I actually my stepfather was a nurse, but he had 35 years of just in the ER.
Oh, no.
So like he did not bounce around. Granted,
Hmm.
very different time. Um, not even just in like, I think a lot of the things that a lot of, boomers experience too is just, there's just a layer of job security that they had back then that isn't here now. And there was, kind of this presumption that staying with a company and demonstrating that loyalty and demonstrating that value will lead to being rewarded. And
Hmm.
that happened instead of, just job hopping like, people today kind of have with the work.
Yeah.
So yeah, he did not jump around, I guess is what I'm saying. So it's just interesting to me to hear this, kind of
Uh-huh.
having been the norm
Uh-huh.
for at least the past 20 years or so.
I was a travel nurse for a long time, so all I did was
Mhm.
jump around, but so I get it. I get both
Yeah.
sides. June 7th, 2007, Kevin and Kimberly split after police were called out for a domestic violence incident in which Kimberly was arrested. She was the aggressor.
Oh,
And then
wow.
in August of that year, Kimberly was hired at DaVita Lufkin Dialysis Center, and that is going to be kind of where the rest of this takes place. And like I said,
So,
dialysis patients, the reason I thought that this case was interesting is dialysis is very hard on the body. I know I've seen a documentary. I think all of the nurses made fun of it on the floor that was like a doctor saying that it was super easy. I'm like, this is hard. We take out your blood, wash it, and give it back. But the body doesn't like fluid shifts. It doesn't like, all of a sudden having a potassium that's really high and then we're dropping it really low, things like that. It's a lot on the body. And these people are already medically fragile. Usually, I mean, dialysis is because your kidneys aren't working. They can't function adequately. They can't filter things out. Um, and so the dialysis is what filters everything out in place of a kidney, essentially. And it takes hours. It's not something that's quick. Most dialysis are like 3 hours or more. And so I thought that this was interesting because I was like, I thought it would be really hard to tell if something was happening at a dialysis center because they are so medically fragile. But I guess a lot of people don't see it that way.
Well, medically fragile also just means that there are a lot. I mean, again, please correct me if I'm wrong. The last thing I want to do is peddle any more medical disinform or misinformation.
Sure.
So, you know, I mean, being medically fragile, I would take to mean there are just a lot of ways this can go wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So, how it did go wrong ultimately, I wouldn't think would be at the top of the list for people trying to, run a diagnostic here.
Mm-hmm.
So, so
Yeah.
that's just kind of the horrifying thing. Like, even if there's a magnifying glass on the situation, you can
Mhm.
still just kind of fall through the
Yeah.
cracks.
And so I tend to be pretty blunt about things. But when talking with coworkers, we actually talked about, I would never be a dialysis nurse. I said,
Right.
as a young nurse, all of my patients that were dialysis patients,
Mhm.
their condition would inevitably worsen to the point
Mhm.
where maybe they couldn't recover at dialysis or right after. Every single one of mine for
Mhm.
2 years solid. And so I was like, I
Mhm.
could never, not a dialysis nurse. And so I just think it's funny here that they're like, oh, I don't know how this happened. Like all of my
Right.
patients, that's where it happened. So it just surprises me
Oh,
the difference in the way people look at things.
absolutely. And like, I mean, what you're describing too, I mean, sounds like you're a hospice nurse without anyone ready for acceptance or closure in any way. So just like, I mean, what
Not
do you
necessarily.
okay.
Yeah, because I mean, it's hard because you end up I feel like being a little more isolated because you have to have dialysis. Most people are at least twice a week. So it's
Mhm.
hard to, vacation, do things like that, sure.
Right.
There is a little bit of quality of life that kind of goes down in that respect, but there are some, younger people that are on it because either congenital issues, things like that, kidneys just aren't there. It can also be temporary in some cases where maybe you're waiting on a transplant and they do the dialysis to get your body through it until we can find you one. So, um,
Mhm.
in later in life, yeah, we kind of get to that point where,
Right.
okay, quality versus quantity. But
Right.
it doesn't always start that way.
So when you say the condition can worsen, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily the end of the road.
Not always. I mean, we can do a lot to fix it, but
Good.
not always.
Okay. Thank you for helping me understand that. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. I know. I try not to be too gruesome about it, but if anybody knows nurse humor, we're very dark and we're very blunt about things. So I'm like, I
Oh
forget
my
not
God.
everybody is that way.
Right. But
So I try
just
to soften the blows.
yeah, but you know what? I feel like more and more people are sort of opening their minds to gallows humor lately.
Yeah,
So yeah, I mean, it's just I think we've all probably been in that situation before on some level where if you can't laugh, or if you can't laugh, you just cry. So
yeah.
yeah, you gotta
All
just
right,
admire the surreal aspects sometimes.
sure. All right. So on April 1st, 2008, 77-year-old Clara Strange was hooked up to a dialysis machine at 11:34 after having her her weight and vitals taken, which is pretty standard, by a patient care technician or PCT as they call them. This was Werlin Guillory. And Werlin went on a break and they passed off their patient to Clara, another coworker. Coming back 30 minutes later, and Clara was clinically dead when Werlin returned.
Hmm.
So the machine had been changed from 400 to 300 cc's a minute, which was under the doctor's prescribed amount of like blood return. So it wasn't coming back the way that it should. Werlin called for help and asked Kimberly what was happening, but they reported that she didn't care to even reply. She just sort of walked away from the mess. So they brought out a crash cart, and unfortunately, Clara was not revived. Not even
Hmm.
5 minutes later, 68-year-old Thelma Metcalf, her blood pressure dropped and she became unresponsive. So this is the second one
Oh
of
my
the day.
goodness.
The crash cart hadn't even been put away before being needed again. And this time, Kimberly was handed an ambu bag, but another PCT named Corey Smith said that while they were doing compressions, you stop and do the ambu bag, and every time she did it, there was no rise in the chest. And so
Mm.
Corey attempted to correct Kimberly, but ended up taking over ventilating the patient. Once again, however, they were unsuccessful in revival. Her blood flow rate on the machine had also been dropped from 300 to 200. So both of them were dropped about 100 cc's a minute. Since the two events
Goodness.
happened so quickly, DaVita officials brought in independent investigators and monitors and immediately instituted a new policy that in the event of a cardiac issue, all the blood tubing was collected with the patient's name and stored in the freezer in a biohazard bag. I'm sure that 2 patients in such a short time is pretty uncommon, but it's not super uncommon that they have issues, dialysis.
So with that being said, like, I mean, is the yeah, I mean, obviously it's alarming when 2 patients are, so quickly have similar
Mm-hmm.
circumstances that leading to death. Obviously you
Yeah.
have to be cognizant of that, but like, is the faultiness of the machines necessarily so common?
No. And we're going to talk
Yeah.
about they checked everything. They checked the
Wow.
tubing, they checked the machines, they checked to make sure that it wasn't something like that.
Oh goodness. Wow. That's just wild.
Yeah. Mhm. So according to the book Killer Nurse, this DaVita location had a history of having issues during inspection starting in 2003, but had started to correct them and they were better by 2008. In 2007, just so that we kind of get a gist of everything, 27 patients died. And then from December 2007 to April 28th, 19 patients died.
Mm.
So again, like I said, hard on the body. This is a process that we're pulling fluids and the body has to adjust. But for the investigation, they looked at into first the water purification system and then the reuse dialyzers or filters. Then they check the medicine. So they're given heparin so that their blood doesn't clot as it's moved in and out. And even then the policies and procedures, but nothing showed where there would be like a greater than average number of cardiac events. So there was no reason that they could find. One of the employees, I think at this time, even joked that, well, if it's not the equipment, it's, got to be somebody here.
Right? Imagine that.
I
Like
know.
if it's a
They
bunch of
they knew
nurses
it without
being
knowing it.
clear on the scientific. Yeah, nurses knowing the scientific method. Imagine that. So
Yeah.
just.
So on April 16th, 2008, Garland Kelly Jr. was hooked up to a machine at 5:30 by PCT Sharon Derman. At 7:30, some of the other staff again went off the floor and Sharon covered the other PCT. And at 7:35 said she turned away from Garland to assist another patient when his alarm went off on the dialysis machine and she turned back to see Kimberly trying to reset it. Garland was
Mm.
unresponsive, so Sharon clamped his lines and started CPR. One of the registered nurses, Sharon Smith, came over and reportedly saw a strange looking blood clot and in the tubing itself, and the facility thought it may be due to the reuse dialyzers. As such, the facility completely cut those out just to make sure it
Mm.
wasn't those. His blood lines were bagged as part of this new policy that they put in place, along with the syringe that was still attached to the top of the line that Kimberly had used and placed in storage. Garland was sent to the hospital and was in a coma for 4 months, and he passed away on August 15th. The same day, in April, another lady, Garciela Castaneda, went unresponsive at 8, and just before passing out, she saw Kimberly doing something to her lines. Staff administered epinephrine, and she survived. Her
Mm.
LDH was 219 2 days before, and upon arrival, it was 2150, and an LDH can indicate cell death. Um,
Mm.
and one of the reasons for cell death is due to bleach intoxication. So they didn't know this at the
Detox.
time, but this will become part of the case.
Inject bleach into your bloodstream, please.
No, no. On April 23rd, 2008, Marie Bradley was hooked up at 11 o'clock, and at 3:30, her blood pressure dropped significantly, as well as her oxygen levels. And she was taken in the hospital. Her LDH went from 169 to 1372, and she was unresponsive at the hospital, but also survived. So we have a couple of survivors. The third patient, Deborah Oates, watched these first two ladies get rushed away, and Kimberly administered medication at 9:13, and within the hour, her blood pressure also started to drop. Her dialysis access began to bleed uncontrollably. She was nauseous and began vomiting, couldn't breathe, and she said that she had a funny taste in her mouth, and she turned and actually asked Kimberly, "What did you give me?" And nurse supervisor, again, the RN Sharon Smith overheard this question and thought it was kind of odd, um, especially given that Kimberly didn't answer. She just turned around and kind of walked away. So one of the PCTs, again, Werlin, that had dealt with Kimberly before, made sure she got an ambulance right away. And Deborah also survived, which I believe is pretty miraculous considering they're getting bleach injected to them.
Absolutely. I mean, and kudos obviously to everyone working there who is, I imagine just they are hyper vigilant at this point
Yeah.
about everything.
Mhm.
But it's one thing to be
Mhm.
hyper vigilant, and it's another thing to act upon it accurate or in a good way. And they
Yes.
clearly did, and they saved
Yeah.
lives.
They did.
It really is miraculous, but it's also, my God, like just the efforts that the people working there had to have taken is just, that's
Yeah.
not lost on me. Because you can know what to do in theory in a situation. It's another to really act upon it.
To
So
do it. Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, they did great. On April 26th, Cora Bryant was hooked up by another nurse, Candace. After having clotting issues with her lines, they were completely changed out, and then her treatment started running as normal. So Candace went on a 15-minute break, coming back to see Kimberly trying to reset the alarms on her machine, so when the alarms go off, the machine automatically stops as a safety protocol.
Mhm.
And Candace said that she thought it was weird that Kimberly was over there because it wasn't her area. But she checked the lines for clots, and seeing none, she restarted the machine. And immediately Cora said that there was a weird taste in her mouth, saying, "What are you giving me?" And then she turned her head and her heart stopped. Fellow PCT member Martha Mann assisted to help and reported Kimberly, again, just stood watching rather than helping. Unfortunately, she remained comatose until her passing. Opal Few came in early the same day to start her treatment, and Donna Hartfeld hooked her up while she was on the floor. Opal was doing well. After returning from lunch, Opal was unresponsive and unable to be revived as well. Kimberly was the breaking nurse. And the supervisor, Sharon Smith, again asked if she gave Opal any medication. Kimberly stated she had, but had not charted it yet. And so Sharon was like, "All right, well, you need to get that charted." And then I think it was days later she reviewed it and she hadn't put anything in.
Oh, wow. Yeah, just
On
way too
April,
many things piling up.
I know. It's such a short time period. Like you're like, "Well, I don't
Yeah,
want to work with her."
right.
Like
Yeah,
how some
I
nurses,
wouldn't personally.
they just end
Yeah.
up with the most fragile patients, and you're like, how do you keep getting the worst of the worst patients? Um, Kimberly is that rain cloud, but hers is self-induced.
Yeah. Yeah. The
On
more
April
I hear
20,
about this woman, the less I like her, I gotta say.
yes, yes. So on the 28th, Kimberly was shifted from med nurse to having a patient section of her own, as they had to call in, or they had like a sick call, and the only person to replace was a registered nurse. And so registered nurses, would trump the LVN, and they would be the ones that were preparing all the medications for everybody. So Kimberly was
Mhm.
reportedly upset, but worked with a team member, PCT Angie Rodriguez, Angie got the station ready, including setting up 2 bleach buckets, one with a 1 to 1,000 ratio and one with a 1 to 10 ratio for cleaning equipment or blood. And you place them on top of one of the machines because they're not allowed to touch the floor. It's a contamination thing. In the healthcare world, we all get it. We're like, oh, hits the floor, it's dirty, you can't use it. Angie hooked up Carolyn, yeah, Carolyn Reisinger, and then Marva Roan. At 8 a.m., she took a break, having Kimberly cover her. And at the time, Kimberly's 2 patients were Lurleen Hamilton and Linda Hall. And they watched as Kimberly placed one of the bleach buckets on the ground, then drew 4 syringes from it. And these are 2 women from 2 different angles seeing about the same thing. After that, she went to Angie's patients and injected them with the syringes. As Angie returned, both of her patients were unwell, but both were stabilized on site. Lurleen told PCT Yasmin Santana that she didn't want Kimberly to touch her and that she had seen something. Linda stated, quote, "Lord, I did too," end quote, which I loved that quote. I had to put it in.
Wow.
Yeah, they both said that while it was happening, they were watching it and it was like surreal. They're like, I can't be seeing this. I'm not seeing this. Like there's a little bit of like, no, right
Yeah.
away. Because this is a nurse. They wouldn't do this.
But you got to
And so then it
process
happens and they're like, oh no.
This is why the element of surprise is so, I guess, underrated, because it's
Yes.
not just that people aren't expecting it. They don't know how to react to that necessarily because it's so jarring.
Yeah.
And I actually do have a question to that experience real quick. So are you saying I know the patients witnessed Kimberly draw bleach into a syringe and pick the bleach up off the floor?
Four syringes, 4 separate ones.
4 separate ones. Did they witness her injecting it into? So they witnessed
Into
her
the
injecting
patients. They saw it. Yeah. And it's not like they can jump up and stop them because they're,
Right.
I mean, they're hooked up to this big machine. So they're just like, and I guess it was one right after the other. She walked to one patient, injected, and then walked directly to the second one. And neither of those were her patients. They were both the other PCT's patients that she was watching.
Goodness.
So of course, I mean, they called one of the other PCTs over, relayed the situation. They both shared the story of seeing her inject bleach into the lines. And then they were cognizant enough, or they were paying attention to her. So they even told them like which sharps containers in the building she dropped those syringes into. Like these women watched and were like, no, they put the bleach syringe right there.
Wow.
And so after telling Yasmin this, the PCT, I'm sure she had no idea what to do. So she went to the director, Amy Clinton, and Amy took Kimberly to the side and asked, because again, what world do you think you're going to encounter this kind of an accusation? And so she said, did you put the bleach on the floor? Kimberly said she did. Again, something against policy. Then she asked if she had given the women any medication, and Kimberly stated no, that she had just run saline through a line through the syringe, which in dialysis is 100% unnecessary. So every patient is hooked up to a saline bag. They have a whole bag of fluid that if something's going on, you can just hit a button and run the fluid itself. There's no reason to hook a separate syringe and push it. And so, of course, Amy's like, what is this? So she sent Kimberly home immediately and then reported the situation to the on-site doctor, Dr. Nazir, who was the nephrologist, so kidney doctor. And Dr. Nazir told the 2 affected patients to go to the hospital for blood work, but didn't initially tell them why. And when they both failed to go, called them at home and then told them it was for a possible bleach poisoning. And so they needed to have their LDH levels checked. And of course, both were elevated. Which is a hard situation because you're like, I don't know, it could be nothing. She might have slipped bleach into you. We have no idea. Nothing like this has happened before. So that's got to be a hard place for the doctor to try and bring that up.
Like, would there be no cameras on site? Just like, is that a common thing?
I don't know down there because I didn't hear of anything coming up on that. Um,
Wow.
I'm sure they do
I
now.
know
They
it was,
didn't.
yeah. Oh, I bet. I mean, I know that it did take a little long. I mean, because from what I understand now, I mean, we're basically just all in a surveillance state. I mean, like, this
Yes,
is
pretty
a
much.
huge reason
CCTV's
why a lot of
everywhere. Yeah.
it is. It is. And, like, there are ways to feel about that for sure. But one part of that is, like, there just aren't a whole lot of serial killers coming to light these days. And it is harder. It is an obstacle for them, of
Mhm.
course, with the caveat that,
I
well,
don't
we just
know.
caught
The
them.
Pacific Midwest, like, or the Pacific Northwest, we still have, I think
Famous for that.
last year we had an active serial killer, I think. So,
Uh,
up in Portland.
is,
And I don't
uh,
know how they got away with it for so long. So Amy and Dr. Nazir both took the sharps containers that the women had identified as having the bleach syringes and kind of put them to the side. They also bagged Marva's bloodlines, but failed to collect Carolyn's, of course. Can't do everything perfect. And then
no,
that evening, they called, the police, and Sergeant Stephen Abbott received the call about the possible tampering, and was sent to investigate. And he brought Corporal Mike Shirley, and these two, I mean, they did the thing. They did wonderfully.
mhm.
Together, they went to the center and kind of learned like what the scope of the situation was after the patients had finished their treatment. So the investigators were like, let everybody finish, like that's already hooked up to machines. And then they kind of shut the building down. They learned a crash course in dialysis because they didn't know anything about it. Not that I expect lay people to. Um, and so because they weren't really sure what to do about this situation, they took all of the sharps containers, and then documented where they took each one from. And then they took all of the tainted blood tubing, as well. And the investigation, throughout the investigation, Sergeant Abbott learned about as much about dialysis and blood as he could. The next day, Kimberly was fired after missing a mandatory meeting held for all employees. The same day, Abbott and Shirley found Kimberly at home, and she agreed to go to the station, though she went back in the house for something, um, which detectives later said that that was probably a mistake. But she said
Mm.
that she had to get rides set up for her children. So she did. She went to the interview, and it started okay. But shortly after, Kimberly started rambling, and investigators think that she had taken something at the home. And you
Mm.
can literally watch the video where she makes sense at first, and then it just starts rambling, and she just goes off. And they end up having to stop the interview at about 50 minutes because they couldn't get anything coherent out of her,
Wow.
which is crazy.
Ugh.
Around 8:30 p.m., police officer Baker was then called back to their residence where he found Kimberly banging on the door and was issued a criminal trespass warning and arrested for public intoxication. And she got to spend the night at jail.
We're all
Not,
clamoring to find information at that point. Just
I
anything to
know.
hold her.
Yeah. I'm like, you are not doing yourself any favors at this point.
No.
So Kevin, remember, this is the estranged husband, went to investigators to tell him he was worried about Kimberly and her browsing history. After his limited assistance, police were able to get a search warrant based on what he said, of hers and her parents' computers were seized, revealing that some searches included, quote, can bleach be detected in dialysis lines, end quote, as well as, quote, dialysis patients' symptoms of bleach poisoning, end quote. So it doesn't
Yeah,
take
I
a
mean,
genius to see.
no. The only way would be maybe obfuscating that search with equally, uh, specific queries about about
Mhm.
dialysis machines. Just like, what it, what if I cut this line, or how to cut this and be undetected, or something like
Yeah,
that. I don't know.
sure. Yeah.
Well, I'm just learning about my craft, right? Just no, I don't think that's gonna fly.
No. On May
The
6th, Kevin
practicality,
received a temporary restraining order against Kimberly. And then, in addition, on May 14th, she finally had her LVN license suspended from that 2005 incident at
That's what
Woodland
it
Heights
takes.
involving the theft of Demerol. So I really feel like her arrest and then this investigation pushed the, Department of Texas to be like, oh, we should
Right.
actually investigate that other one that's been sitting there for a few
Right.
years.
Oh my God.
Uh,
Oh man.
Sergeant Abbott went to Clyde Harrington, the DA, for assistance on the case. At this point, and Harrington brought in a couple different people. He brought in Chris Tatores and Lane Thompson. Jim Hershey and Bill Horton were also investigators at the Texas Attorney General's office. And Joe Riker, a special agent with the U.S. Office of Inspector General. And they all came together to sort of help provide assistance on this investigation. It sounds like at first they didn't know, where to send the blood, that they could prove that there's bleach in it. So there's a lot of these guys getting together and figuring out where they could go. And I think part of it, they had to send it to like specialty labs, but they wanted to make sure that they wouldn't, um, use up all the samples or whatnot, so they could still have it in case they needed it sent somewhere else. But
Right.
it was a pretty good investigation they did.
I'm so impressed by this, honestly. Just all around, not just the investigation, but just the witness it because I'm just how important was that witness testimony of her filling the just the syringes with bleach because
Hmm.
obviously if you test for bleach, yeah, then you can clearly diagnose what's going on, but it's also like why would you think bleach would be the issue here, like
Hmm.
you got to think of it from like a okay, what does bleach do to the blood specifically, could this be caused by any number of other things, which the answer I'm
Hmm.
sure, again, not a medical professional, but I'm sure the answer is yes. There's going to be a
Yes.
lot of convoluted information out there because of the
Hmm.
context of it all, there it's
Yeah.
not like you just test for bleach and be like arrest her, day's over.
Yeah. And the investigators, like I said, when they really did put in a ton of work for this. They
Yeah.
also realized that they were dealing with two women that, again, medically fragile, are up there in age, and they actually got both of their testimony recorded. I guess there are some like, stipulations that they're allowed to record it. Uh, to be used in trial in the event of their passing. So they still had it. And it worked out. One of the women did actually pass away before the trial. And so
Mm.
they needed it. And so that he
Texas
had the
is,
forethought to do that was pretty amazing.
yeah, I think Texas is one of the states that has one-way recording consent still. I
Well,
know
it
with
was, yeah, it wasn't necessarily that. It was just the, interview recording.
ah,
Because a lot of people, you have to have the witness take the stand.
right.
But I guess there's a clause that if you know, there's a likelihood that they'll pass that you can record it. And that's
Mm-hmm.
kind of what they used to get these in place, which was
Mm.
amazing.
Wow.
So, with all the work they put in, on May 30th, 2008, Kimberly Saenz was arrested for 2 counts of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. While in the background, the investigators all tried to put together pieces for those that were murdered to see if Kimberly was involved. They sent out the bloodlines. Again, their lab didn't have the resources. The syringes were also tested, and one 3C syringe labeled with Opal's name on it came back positive for bleach, and she was one of the victims.
Yeah.
Oh, Kimberly was bonded out by her family, and on March of 2009, just so you know, she worked at a local dermatology clinic. This time
Whee!
only as a receptionist, but couldn't get away from the
Okay.
medical field, I guess.
When you have a
On
calling, I guess.
I, I guess. On April 1st, a grand jury session is held, and Kimberly Saenz is indicted on capital murder charges of 5 patients.
Mm.
And then in July of 2009, DA Harrington told um, the lawyer that Kimberly's family appointed, Ryan Deaton, that they were going to seek the death penalty. And
Mhm.
Deaton was not certified as a state death penalty specialist. And so they brought in Stephen Christopher Taylor. I didn't know that you had to be certified as a
Hmm.
death penalty lawyer, like a specialist. Bail was set again at the $50,000 by Judge Ryan, and 10% had to be paid out. Harrington said he didn't oppose her being on bail, but she got to be out for 4 years before the trial would occur, which
That's
excessive.
terrifying.
The date of April 5th, 2010 was set for jury selection. It was later moved to September 9th. In August, the defense requested another continuance, saying they needed more time to properly prepare for expert witnesses, and for some reason the judge granted it, even though we're already 4 years in.
Mm.
The new date was set for March 5th, 2012.
Mm-hmm.
So January 23rd, 2012, jury selection began. And then on March 5th, the actual trial began. And Deaton attempted to tell the judge that he hadn't had time to adequately prepare for opening statements before the jurors
Wow.
even filed in, for which he was reprimanded. And he sounds like he's a lawyer that just got on the judge's nerves through this entire trial, like
Well, kicking the can down the
constantly.
road will do that.
Yeah, they're like, oh,
Trying
you've
to,
had time. You've had
yeah,
time.
you're undermining the authority of the court. I don't think the people presiding are going to be thrilled about that, especially
Right.
when this person has a history of violence
Yeah.
on her record.
So day one, other than opening statements, they had witnesses and testify along with day two. And then day three, they brought in the survivors, and the whole day was them telling their stories of what happened. By March 19th, it was time for the prosecution to rest and allow defense to begin. And Deaton sounds like he was pretty arrogant again this whole time. Multiple times the judge had to bring him up front to speak to him about it. In one instance specifically, Harrington stood to object, leading the witness. And when that was sustained, the court says that he didn't even sit down. He just waited for the next question. And as soon as it was asked, he objected to that too. He was like, I just know that you're going to continue doing it.
Mm.
On March 28th, both prosecution and defense finally rested. And it wasn't until after Harrington spent 30 minutes in closing, reminding the jury that witnesses had corroborated evidence. How Kimberly treated herself unprompted during interviews, stated she never looked at bleach poisoning. While in other interviews, she acknowledged using a 10cc syringe to draw out bleach. Then she showed pictures of the victims, or he showed pictures, excuse me, while giving their names one more time. And Ryan Deaton spent 2 hours in his closing, claiming that Kimberly was a scapegoat, that witnesses were told what to say, not that they were just given instructions to tell the truth. And after drawing on, Harrington was allowed his rebuttal. And sources say he sprang up out of his seat so fast that it surprised the entire court. Like he just was pissed. He berated Deaton for his falsifications, for misrepresenting and vilifying witnesses. And in the end, with tears like running down his face, he said, quote, "Why do mothers scold their babies? You don't need to know what evil is to recognize it," end quote, which I thought was a pretty good quote.
Mic drop.
Yes. After this, it was up to the jury to decide, and they deliberated for approximately a day and a half. And Foreman Larry reported they had finally come to a unanimous verdict. I'm surprised it took that long.
That is curious.
Well, you'll see. So, on the charges, on count one, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon for Marva Rones, guilty. Count four for Marie Bradley, guilty. Count five for Deborah Oates, guilty. However, count two and count three, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon for Carolyn Reisinger and Graciela Castaneda, were not guilties. Count six was the big one. That's their capital murder count, and that was found guilty. 3 days later, the sentencing phase began, and in the end, she received life without the possibility of parole plus 60 years. And 51-year-old Kimberly is currently serving her time at Patrick L. O'Neill facility in Texas.
Well, when there's 6 counts against her, that does shed a little more light on the delineation process. But, oh man, just what a nightmare. Just what an absolute nightmare. I know that this woman, obviously, like I said, she had a history of violence, that she was in the domestic dispute alone. I find it just kind of really jarring because it's not to say that you can't make the connection between a violent person and a murderer.
Mhm.
It's just to say that I don't know what the domestic violence charges specifics are, but like, there are a lot of situations where, in those cases where people just kind of lo- lose it, I guess, just kind of
Yeah.
heat of passion. It's not to say it's justifiable. Of course it's not.
Hmm.
It's just to say that this is behavior that is a little more, you know, just kind of shows that she doesn't have as much control over herself, I would say. But
Hmm.
then the manner in which she commits these murders is just so calculated and cruel
Yeah,
to a
she
point,
thought
of
about it.
course. I mean, she was too a little cavalier, I guess, about filling those syringes in front of patients.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
yeah, but
And
even so,
I,
like, it just the profile's weird.
yeah, and I think the not guilty, the two, because there was two not guilties. Carolyn was one of the women that when I talked about, they forgot to pull the blood tubing for her. So I
Mm.
think it just became, is there reasonable doubt for her? And I couldn't see the reason why, but in both of them, they said, they didn't have the full, like all of the evidence for these ladies. And so prosecution couldn't, without the reasonable doubt, say for these two that they were committed by Kimberly. And
Was
so they were
Carolyn
trying
the
to be
first
very
victim?
fair, but I'm surprised by it.
Yeah. Was Carolyn the first victim?
No, she's not the first, but she was one of the ladies that was, there was multiple on the same day. I
Ah.
think she's the second after
Oh,
they decided to start pulling the blood tubing.
gotcha. Right, right.
Um,
Yeah. So,
and
I mean,
yeah, they pulled one and
it's
not the other.
yeah, and that's terrifying. Like, if she had been the only victim, you know,
Hmm.
just how something, a matter of protocol. I mean, and this happens to
Hmm.
police departments. We see this, it's unfortunately, it's not typical, but it's not uncommon either, I
Hmm.
guess, is how I'd say it. But, man, man, oh man.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, thank you for listening to my story. And I definitely had fun listening to you talk about H. Holmes today.
Thank you. I had fun talking about it, and I've had fun being part of this too.
Yeah. And do you want to plug the name of your podcast again one more time?
I would love to.
No
Thank you
Holmes
so
Barred.
much. So again, my name is Daniel Ciarrocchi, and you can listen to a dark comedy, actually, dark comedy historical fiction audio play called No Holmes Barred about H. Holmes and the 1893 World Fair in Chicago. Follow us on the socials at Holmes Barred, and check us out at noholmesbarred.com. Sign up for our mailbag. We got some events coming in the works, so stay tuned.
I love it. Thanks so much. And to all those out there listening, be careful. It's a dangerous world we live in.